So the first way that we can connect remotely to our Raspberry Pi is via SSH or Secure Shell. Essentially, this is a command line utility that allows us to connect to our Raspberry Pi where we would be logged in and we can perform instructions from the command line to control our Pi. So before we get going, the first thing we'd need to do is make a note of the IP address that was assigned to us when our Pi connected to our network. So if you hover over the Wi-Fi icon, here you'll be able to easily see what the IP address is. In my case, it's 10.0.0.106. Or alternatively, via the command line, you can type in ifconfig. And looking at the WLAN 0 here, as you can see, you will also see the IP address here, 10.0.0.106. So make a note of that IP address because it's important. We're going to need that when we connect via SSH. Something else that we need to ensure is that connecting via SSH is enabled on your Raspberry Pi. And if you followed along in the configuration settings and when we looked at the various options, here you'll be able to see on the interfaces SSH was enabled. So this needs to be enabled for us to connect via SSH, and also we can see via VNC, which we will address a little bit later. These two need to be enabled before we can connect remotely. So once we've taken care of those housekeeping rules, let's go ahead and first look on a Mac or a Linux machine how we can SSH via a terminal. So on a Mac, I'm going to just fire up here a terminal, and you want to ensure, of course, that the PC or laptop you're connecting to your Raspberry Pi with is on the same network. So if they're not on the same network, they can't talk to each other. So make sure that whatever device you're trying to remotely access your Pi with is on the same network for the SSH demonstration. So the command we're going to type in is SSH, and we put in the Pi user, and then we enter the IP address that we made a note of. So in my case, it was 10.0.0.106, and tap enter. It would give you a prompt to validate that you're connecting and what the key fingerprint is. So just type in yes, and then you have to type in your password. So this would be the password that you initially reset when we did our configuration settings. If you didn't reset it, it would be Raspberry, but go ahead and enter your password here. And now we are actually connected to our Raspberry Pi. So we can take a look at the file system. This is the file system that's on the Pi, and now that we're connected via SSH, we can actually run commands on the Pi and control our Pi just as if we were physically connected via the keyboard that's connected to the USB slot of the Raspberry Pi. So it allows us to administratively control the Pi and work with it and in a very, very powerful way using Linux on the command line. So that essentially is the SSH connection from our Mac. We can copy files, delete files, start and stop processes, and so on, install software, and we have full reign to do whatever we need to do via the command line. This is, of course, because the Pi user has privileges to be able to run and execute commands on your Raspberry Pi. Now let's take a look from Windows. If we're on a Windows machine and we're trying to connect via SSH to our Raspberry Pi, how do we accomplish this? Well, what we can do is we can download a client called Putty, and it's freely available. If you open up a browser and you Google Putty, okay, the first link here from putty.org, you can download this Putty SSH client, and it is very easy and straightforward to set up. So I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to click on the installer file. I'm running a 64-bit version of Windows. If you're running a 32-bit, you can click on the 32-bit correspondingly. So once this is downloaded, we can double-click the installer file, and we'll be able to install Putty. Here the installer comes up. We're just gonna hit next. You can leave that path as default. If you want to add a shortcut to your desktop, you can go ahead and select that and click on install. So you would get a prompt to allow the installation, and you're done. So that's it. It's fairly straightforward. And now we can proceed to fire up Putty. And here we need to enter the IP address of our Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to enter 10.0.0.106, which is my IP address. You enter yours accordingly. Make sure that SSH is checked on port 22. Click on open. Of course, it will give you a security alert for the very first time for you to accept the fingerprint. So go ahead and click on yes. Log in as you want to put in Pi as your user. And of course, your password is going to be the password that you would have set. So I'm going to type that in here. Notice as you're typing in the password, you actually don't see the prompt moving. That's just how the Putty client is. But when you're done entering the password, hit enter, and voila! Now we're connected to our Raspberry Pi. So I can execute my commands here. I can do a pwd, I can do an ls, and I can see the files that are on there and so on. So from Windows, I'm able to remotely access my Raspberry Pi via SSH. Now I'm at the command line and I can execute instructions on my Raspberry Pi.